Hello, this is Alan Zundell, and the program is Political Dharma. On today's episode, what I'd like to talk about is what's wrong with capitalism. And I'm going to approach that in a series of steps. First, I want to briefly return to the ideas of Karl Marx that I discussed in the previous episode. And then I want to move to a simple definition of capitalism, just so we have an idea of what we're talking about, and identify the aspect of it that I think is most problematic. I'm going to try to illustrate the problem with it in a simple illustration, and then move on to what I think is wrong with capitalism, which is essentially that the ability for firms to create profit is primarily based on the use of political power, not in any sense, or maybe in a very restricted sense, on the contribution to social welfare in general, or on their on the appropriate returns to capital investments. So that's what I'm talking about. That's where I'm heading. So let's start with Marx. And I said last week in discussing a book by his close colleague and friend, Friedrich Engels, that Engels believed Marx made two contributions to the theory of society. And I agree that that was what Marx spent most of his life's work on. Marx was an intellectual. He had a PhD in philosophy. He spent most of his life in reading, researching, writing, and corresponding with other intellectuals, not necessarily professional intellectuals, but his profession was not in an academic post, but as a journalist, where he edited and contributed to various journals and newspapers, often as a freelancer or in editorial positions that didn't last long. He supported himself mostly through money from his family early on in his life, his parents, and then his mother after his father died, and then from his friend Engels, who had a father who had a set of manufacturing facilities that Engels inherited. So Marx spent most of his life as an intellectual, less time on organizing, and his two big projects in his intellectual life were, number one, a theory of history, contributing to a theory of history. And there, I think he had a lot of good contributions to make that we can still learn from. And it's worth studying that aspect and trying to apply it. Now, I wouldn't say that everything he had to say about history was correct, but this is the nature of intellectual development, is that somebody comes along, they make a contribution, and then other people can build on that and eventually see problems with that and go further in either adjusting the theory or working around it. His second contribution, according to Engels, was in the area of economic theory. And here's where I think he was less successful. Engels mentions the theory of surplus value. And here what Marx's project was really is to critique the emergence of economics as an intellectual field. It had been developing for over 100 years before him, but as capitalism developed, Adam Smith, David Ricardo, and others who preceded Marx began to lay out the foundations for describing this new economic development in a way that has, at that time, I think, and certainly since then, tended to justify capitalism and not just explain it, and see it as somehow the culmination of rational development in social progress. Marx, on the other hand, in his historical work, showed that capitalism was but one in a series of stages of development that also had internal contradictions that, similar to earlier stages of economic organization, had to be resolved in some changed form of economic organization. So he saw economics as something that was still developing and would go beyond capitalism, whereas the classical economics theorists and contemporary economists are mostly looking at as capitalism as something that is in itself a rational system well suited to meeting human needs and social welfare. Anyway, so he's critiquing this emergent field of economics, and he looked at it and said, well, there's contradictions here too. Just like there are contradictions within the real world of capitalism, there are contradictions within your economic theory. And here he used their own theory of the labor theory of value to develop this idea of surplus value, how essentially he could show using their own tools, or he attempted to show using their own tools, that profits came from exploiting workers, paying them less than they actually contributed to the products of production. That sounds very repetitive, products of production. Well, so that was his project. And around the time of Marx, people began to critique the labor theory of value, that he rested his calculations on his development of his critique. And they eventually moved on to another theory, which is the marginal theory of productivity, which became widely used in economics. And that has its critics as well. But as far as trying to move forward in a project of moving beyond capitalism, which is what I'm trying to do, I think we can look to Marx for a lot of insight on history and historical development, but less to his critique of economics as being that useful. You'll often hear the labor theory of value criticized, and sometimes it's called Marxist labor theory of value, and it wasn't his theory. He just used it to make points that the classical economists were not making. And since the economics profession in general has abandoned labor theory of value, Marx's critique seems anachronistic. And I'm not an economist, but I've looked into, to some degree, Marx's theory of surplus value and how he uses the labor theory of value. And I've looked into marginal productivity. And to me, both of them have the same flaws. I would call them flaws, but also the reason why I have less interest in them is that they are both based on abstract theory. You're trying to simplify human relations and then to draw out of it precise definitions of things that don't always match the real world expression of the things that you're building concepts around, and then use mathematics to try to demonstrate how it works or how it could work better, or in Marx's case, why it's not going to work better, why you have to go beyond capitalism. So economic theory, it seems to me, abstract and removed from reality. My field is political science. That was what I was trained in. I have my PhD in that, and I've spent much of my life looking at politics and political movements and political activism and things along that nature. So my real interest is power, not so much critiquing economics. I'll leave that to other people who are more competent, but my analysis is rests on power. And here's where I think, as I said previously, even though Marx's theory of surplus value may not hold up well, and I doubt that it does, even Marxists have conceded that, although there are still those who try to cling to and defend Marx's theory there. I suspect it's not going to hold up to scrutiny. And I would simply go back to what Marx was looking at and say, here we see contradictions in the real world. And this is what I'm trying to explain using your own economic theory, that there are contradictions in the theory as well. The contradictions in the real world are obvious because they persisted since the time of Marx. They were there before Marx, they were there at the time of Marx, they continue up to today. Now, there's periods in time where people try to deny that they're there, because one of the things Marx talked about was periodic crises in the economic system, and in periods where things like seems are going relatively well for most people, like in the 1960s in Western Europe or in the United States, or in the 1990s here, there's a lot of voices saying, well, see, capitalism, we've been able to solve its problems. It really is fundamentally a solid system. It just has, you have to do a mop-up operation to fix some of the problems of it. But every time we enter a period of crisis, like in the 2008 crash of the financial system, or currently with all the worries around the banking system and inflation and monetary policy, whether it's fixing it or making it worse, again, we're in a period of crisis. So what Marx had to say about this in brief was that because capital is stealing from labor, they are piling up wealth in fewer and fewer hands, and this causes problems. Some of the problems are that working people do not do very well, but the wealthy get very, very wealthy because wealthy people want to invest some of their money, not spend it all. They don't have that much. Their needs are basically met with their income. So they're trying to invest money. At the same time, working people, the vast majority of people, don't have the income to buy the products that they're producing. So you continually have these crises based on mismatch between investment and consumption that are recognizable in history. Also, you see that in a market economy because laborers who are low wage or people who only have their labor to offer but can't find a job for one reason or another, or people who are disabled and can't work, they all have very limited incomes, and sometimes their needs are not met at all because we have a market economy in which wealth is going towards the most wealthy, more so than in the hands of other people. It's not geared toward meeting needs, but towards making money, towards making profits for capitalists, essentially, so that those who don't have money, their needs are not being met. So it's not really a system in which human needs are being well met. It's a system in which it's piling up money in the hands of a few. So he saw crises, he saw human suffering, and these things are still with us. Especially today, you can see it more than you would have in the fairly recent decades, few decades ago, that this generation is doing much worse, and its prospects are worse than my generation, for example, and certainly than my parents' generation. So you can see people becoming impoverished again, even though they have sometimes have a good standard of living or an acceptable standard of living. They're piling up debt to the extent that they can't sustain that. And at some point, all this is going to come to a crash. So that much for Marx. Now, where am I at with this? I'm trying to show that the problem Marx was addressing was the increasing inequality, that most of the wealth created was going into few hands due to capitalists getting profits from their individual enterprises, and that problems flowed from that. What I'm going to say is that even if you don't look at Marx's theory of why profits are going to capitalists, that it's all stolen from labor. I think some of it, in a sense, is stolen from labor. There is exploitation going on. It's a matter of political power, and he would have agreed with that as well, that it's not the kind of benign system economists are presenting it as. It's really fundamentally based on using political power to extract value from other people. So what is capitalism? Here, essentially, the main features of capitalism, these are familiar to you. Number one, it is an economy in which there are various units of production and consumption. By production, businesses that produce products and services, and there are units of consumption like individuals or households, or maybe a commune or something like that where they consume as a group, but mostly individuals and households, and they relate to each other through market agreements. So they make financial transactions that they agree to, and then they try to adhere to them. Number two, and because of that, it's a money economy, because money facilitates these exchanges and these interactions between units. Number two, it is a private property system, meaning that you can own the means of production as an individual or as many individuals coming together, owning property. And then number three, it's run for creating profits for those owners. That is the main purpose of producing units, is to create profits for owners, not necessarily to meet the needs of the consuming units, but to create profit for investors. So that's what's around. And what I'd say is the most important flaw with that is the part about individual units of production being run in order to produce profits. And I'm going to try to explain that, why that's a problem in fairly simple terms. The question here is not just the problems that created by that, which I've just outlined, the social ramifications of inequality of wealth and the way profits tend to pile up in fewer hands, and there's less for people that aren't having their needs met very well. What I like to focus on is, where does profit come from in the individual firm? So if you have a system based on all these different individual units of production pursuing profits for their owners, where's that profit coming from? How is it being created? Now, if you think in very simple terms about a unit of production, a business, they have various types of expenses. They need natural resources, raw materials, material resources, put it that way. Some of them are natural resources like raw materials, and others are technological things like buildings, things that people build from other materials. Buildings, vehicles, machinery, tools, all that. So that's an expense. Another expense is labor, because you always have to have labor doing something with these various products. And then they also have the expense of taxes to help pay for the infrastructure that they rely on, roads, communication systems, everything that government provides, law and order, court system to enforce contracts, all these things. So they pay a share of taxes. And then some kind of payment for the provision of capital. So in order to obtain the labor, to pay labor and to buy the resources they need, or to rent them in some cases, they need to have money, because this is a money economy, right? And so they can raise that money in various ways. Now, one of the ways they can do it in an already established firm is to go out and borrow money from a bank. And what they'll do is they'll ask the bank for a loan and explain to them their business plan, how they are going to pay this loan back. And then the bank will look at how risky it is and whether this business seems to be creditworthy and have the good plan for paying them back. And it will give them the loan, and over time, the firm will pay that loan back with interest. So what is the, once that loan's paid back, what is the contribution of the owner of the capital that their profit is coming from? Like, why is some of that money going to them? Now, how is it even coming to them? Because if you're selling this to consumers, you're in a market where there are other competitors for the same product or service that you're providing, and consumers are going to look for the lowest price at a given quality of product, right? So there's always going to be this competition that drives down profits, because each of the firms is trying to keep its price low enough to get a lot of customers and to cover their costs. So this is shrinking the profit margin for them. How then, when they're in this position, do they create profits? And how then, if they've already paid back the loan, do they justify that the profits should be going to them? What are they contributing now to the business firm? Maybe the entrepreneur is gone now and they've sold the business off, and you just have a bunch of shareholders. What are the shareholders contributing that they deserve dividends, say, or some share in the profits of the firm? So those are the questions I want to ask. Now, where does the profits come from? Marx said it's primarily from exploiting labor, and he tried to explain this a great deal. It's kind of clear, isn't it? That superior bargaining power of capital providers versus labor allows them to create deals that are advantageous for them. Now, what I want to say is that even in this case, when you can get labor at a lower cost because you kind of force them to take a bad bargain, which is what they do repeatedly in different scenarios, not every single laborer is getting a bad bargain, but most of them are. Then another firm can match that. They can also lower the price of their labor. And you have this, again, this cycle of competition. So there's a race to try to find another way to lower your costs or whatever. So one of the ways that they increase their profits is by using their superior bargaining power. That is, you have very few capitalists negotiating with a lot of workers, a lot of potential workers, and it's obviously harder for an individual worker to find a decent job than it is for a capitalist firm to find workers to replace workers who don't like the deal they're being offered. Number Two in that is that government buttresses this and really facilitates it all along, the law all along, by giving a right to the property owner to, negotiate with laborers. And when they're organized, so you have a small set, maybe a single proprietor or a partnership, in which they have the right to run the firm for their own purposes. And when laborers try to organize in order to meet them as a group, they've been shot, they've been beaten up, they've been driven out of the factory, and thrown in jail. The government fully backs up the owner in that case, and this is our history of it. Later on, when union organizing was legalized, still it's more difficult to get a union together and create a united front in negotiating than it is to incorporate a bunch of shareholders and have a united front in negotiating. So always the advantage is to the capital owners, and this is backed up by government power and the fear of government power, that it's difficult for laborers to get a better negotiating position. But once you're able to lower your labor costs, again, your competitors can do the same thing. So here you have a dynamic of kind of a race to the bottom, and then there's workers who try to push back, and sometimes if they can gain enough government influence, the government tries to push back. But it's the same story, that this advantage over your competitors by lowering your labor costs is eventually going to erode because of competition. Now, according to economists, the main way that capitalist firms create a profit is by things like innovation. Well, innovation is the main thing here, is either finding a better method of utilizing your resources in order to create your product, that is organizing workers in a more efficient way, or using technology in a way that uses resources in a more efficient way, or developing a new product. You come up with a better idea. It's either as an entrepreneur or as a research department in a for-profit corporation, or it could even be a government researcher. But you come up with a new idea for a product that hasn't been developed before, and you're using the resources to make that product that are more, the product is more valued to the customer than alternative uses of those resources. So there again, you have a profit. You have a advantage over other producers because you're producing something new that people want more than they want the alternatives that you could use those resources for. But again, that profit's going to erode as competitors try to duplicate your methods of production or duplicate your product. Now, the one exception here is when you can just get a kind of a status symbol, make a status symbol of your product, like Nike did with their Air Jordans. And because you can only get it from Nike, you can't match it. Other firms can try to gain that kind of status. It's a little harder to do, but eventually the status effect wears off as well. So economists focus on this thing, the innovation, and economy-wide, it's true that there's continual innovation, that firms, in order to continue to prove profits, have this incentive to try to continually innovate, to reduce the use of resources, use labor more efficiently, which is not always to the advantage of laborers. They might work them harder and faster as a way of labor efficiency. But you have this constant innovation, but it's different firms at different times that are doing this. So it's not any individual firm that's contributing to the greater wealth of society, but it's the system as a whole that's producing more products with the same amount of resources, or maybe less resources, and meeting needs of various consumers in a better way. People feel more satisfied with what they're receiving from the economy, assuming they have the money to buy things. So it does contribute to social welfare in those respects. The society becomes more wealthy. That is, there's more products and services being produced for people to make use of. But it's not something every individual firm can do. So firms still look for ways to reduce profits, such as lowering the cost of labor, which is not socially advantageous, because you're going to have people who are trying to make it on a very low income, and increased inequality is going to lead to increased political inequality and periodic crises, as I mentioned before. Now, there's other ways to try to create profits as well, and they all implicate political power. For example, externalities. You can externalize costs. your waste that you produce could be harming other people. Say pollution. Your firm might pollute the land around you with chemical leaks into the ground, or waterways, or the air with air pollution. And you just push those costs onto other people. Now, in economic theory, those people who are harmed could be compensated so that the costs of the harm are incorporated within the firm's expenses. But to do this, you have to have some kind of lawsuit, a mechanism for people to demonstrate they've been harmed and that the source of the harm is that firm. That's very difficult to do when you think about it. An individual firm that is causing these kind of harms, if they're accused of it, they can hire an army of lawyers to defend themselves, whereas you have a bunch of individual people who have to somehow get together and hire lawyers and then prove not only that they've been harmed, but that harm has been caused by this particular firm that they're suing. It's a very difficult task. So there again, the corporation has the advantage. And in the case of air pollution, not air pollution, but climate change with carbon in the atmosphere and methane in the atmosphere, it's even more difficult because there's the people harmed are so diffuse. It's everybody. And the sources of the pollution are diverse as well. So who are you going to hold to blame? You can hold the oil companies, but they'll say, well, we only did a part of this. It's also the people producing cars and the people using the cars, and it's agriculture, and it's all these different sources of carbon. So it's difficult it's easier for a firm to externalize the cost of their production than it is for people to be compensated for those costs. So again, it's a way of producing profits in the short term. Eventually, other firms will do the same things unless there's a pushback from the government. And even there, they try to get around it as a way of increasing their profits. But for the firm, it's a temporary fix, right? There's other things you could say. They try to reduce their taxes by lobbying government to shift the cost of taxation to other people, mostly in the middle class, because they have the incomes. So the wealthy and the corporations are paying less in taxes than their share. That might look fair. Middle class people, people with some income levels who have money they could pay taxes with, are more harmed. Of course, the poor don't pay as much in taxes, so it's not harming them as much. But again, you're shifting the burden of your costs to somebody else. And if you have political power because you're wealthy, that's easier to do. It's harder for the people who are in the majority to fight back when the political system is stacked in favor of the wealthy. I could go on. You also try to fix your prices, collude with other businesses to keep your prices above your costs. That's been made illegal, but to some extent, they still do it implicitly. They kind of look around. What are other firms charging? I'm going to charge the same thing. And so you don't have undercutting. You also have, government contracts like military contracts that guarantee you a profit. We'll buy your bomber jets. Plus, we'll give you not only the cost of producing these, but the profit as well. Or you can use the United States government and that military force to get resources at below market value from other countries. You go in and you topple a government in another state, for example, Iraq, and you get their oil at a reduced price, reduce their market, and they've done this in a number of countries. Western corporations utilize, especially in the United States, utilize their military power to gain resources from other countries by controlling those governments or overthrowing governments and instating a government that's more amenable to treating corporations from the West more kindly, giving them better deals on raw materials. So various ways, but they cause harm to other people. So the social welfare of producing more stuff also has to be balanced against the social harms that are continually being produced. And because profit is the main incentive in the system, firms are going to use all of these methods, and whichever one seems to work the easiest. They'll continue, every time they have competition that's reducing their profit margin, they'll keep looking for other ways to make profits. And one of the end results of this is they end up in a speculative system. This is the financialization of the economy that's happened in the United States and a number of other Western nations, where it's not as profitable to actually produce things. You start engaging in gambling with your money and you speculate. That is, you buy assets like homes, like buildings, in the hope that the price is going to rise and you can sell it at a higher cost. Now, they aren't contributing to wealth of the society at all here. There's no change in the number of houses. There's no change in the quality of the houses. There's simply somebody buying it at one point, selling it at another point for a profit that's purely based on speculation. And here there's a risk side that the price of it might go down. They might not realize the profit. They might actually realize a loss. But again, they use government power, as we are seeing in the banking crisis, to back up and to make good those investors by guaranteeing deposits or bailing out banks or whatever, techniques the Federal Reserve can come up with or the U.S. Treasury can come up with. So they reduce the risk, sometimes at the cost of taxpayers and sometimes at the cost of greater inflation or other secondary effects of the measures they take. They reduce the risk, but allow them to continue to have profits. So in all these cases, you see political power being used and the power of competitive advantage, not competitive advantage, how am I trying to say it? Unequal bargaining position between capitalists and everybody else to create a system in which the pursuit of profit not only produces some goods that the defenders of capitalism like to focus on, but produce a whole lot of harms that are only escalating over time as the system escalates. Now let's go back to 1 second to say, what about this firm that essentially just meets consumer needs at cost? Why do you have to have a profit? What is the role of profit? There's no role except as an incentive for capitalists who have the wealth in their hands to invest in particular businesses, to make their capital available so that a business can go out and buy the stuff they need to produce what they're going to produce. You could run things at cost as long as capital was able to be provided in some way that didn't involve getting a profit. All right, so that's the kind of analysis I have here, that political power is the main source of profit. No, that's the main key to profit making, political power and unequal bargaining position. And then it produces a number of harms to society by extracting value from some people and giving it to other people who already have wealth and power. That's how the system works in my eyes. Where else do I want to go with this? For right now, what I'd say is I'll end with my policy program that I continually tout. I think there are ways to fix this. And it goes in a few key areas. Number one, democratization. We have to fix the political system so it's more responsive to the mass of people rather than to the wealthy. And there's a number of ways to do that. I think you got to start with reform of voting methods, which is why I've been working on that for about 20 years. Number two, you got to increase the power of workers so they can fight back against the attempts to speed them up and reduce their pay and benefits. And continue to support workers in their ability to organize and negotiate to the point where they take control of a firm. So you have workers' control, which would mean that then capital is simply a matter of providing capital in return for repaying a loan with interest, rather than continually providing more and more profit or profit over the long term. I'll explain that maybe in another episode. But you could have this steady state system in a sense where you're meeting needs at cost without necessarily needing to run a profit. Workers will be happy to have their jobs stable and well paid if possible. So workers control, social investments like through a public bank system and various community banks and credit unions and things like that, that they are aggregating capital in order to provide it without needing a profit. They use it for social purposes. What are the real needs of society? We can invest in those things and not even necessarily need to meet costs for it. If it has social benefits that you can't capture in a price, you still provide it because it's important. Number three would be fair taxation system. And number four would be along the lines of reducing government. Once you get these other things in place, since the main function of government is to buttress the power of capital, you could vastly reduce the size of the government if you have these other things in place. So democratization, um, bolstering the power of labor to organize and bargain and negotiate with capital, social investment institutions like public banks, credit unions, community banks, things like that, the fair taxation system, and the reduction of government, especially in its aspects of military and other forms of coercion that we have domestically that are mainly used to, well, won't go into that in this particular episode. So that's this episode. And I think why this is important to go back to Marx and kind of depart from Marx a little bit in this is because there is the way you understand these problems is going to have some effect on the program or the strategies you use to try to move beyond capitalism. And you create a particular culture around that, the culture of the movement, right? Now with Marx, because he focuses purely on the extraction or the exploitation of labor by capital, it is very much it creates a culture of antagonism between capitalists and labor. And that antagonism is there already, class conflict is there. But it also means that in organizing, what you're going to do is try to focus mostly on the working class. And then you have all kinds of questions about what about people that are on Social Security or disability income? What about people that don't have a job, the homeless? What about in Marx's time or shortly after? What about peasants? How do you incorporate them into the movement? What about intellectuals? What's their stake in this? So in order to bring a bigger coalition together, I think it's important to show how this harms us all. You're not necessarily going to get capitalists on your side, if maybe some, if they're amenable to reason and can see that society as a whole, including them, would be better off. But you're not organizing around the principle simply of antagonism between the classes. And here I'd like, again, to point to Gandhi as creating a different culture for a movement in which he had objectives that he was off after, and he's building political power. But it had a different culture. It had one in which they refused to engage, refused to cooperate with the system, right? It was mostly a non-cooperation movement, and one in which embraced anybody that accepted their goals and their methods. So the culture of Gandhi, rather than the culture that arose out of the Marxist movement and its trajectory down through the years, is something I'm interested in. That's my presentation for this week. It's kind of longish. Maybe I was a little long-winded. Hope to hear your comments. You can find my Facebook page. You can also find my YouTube videos or my podcast versions, the audio versions of these episodes, if you go to my website, politicaldharma.com. Thanks for listening. Again, I close with a song from Patty Rose and Joey Elish, and hope you come back again. Thank you very much. Bye.
With ease, I see the chains are breaking. We gained our focus. The moves we're making will prove to determine our self-worth as a passenger on this vehicle Earth.